Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the show. A lot happening across college football with a number of major college football programs making head coaching changes. One of those being Pat Fitzgerald at Michigan State. We told you about Spartan Ventures earlier in the program, the new nonprofit arm of MSU Athletics, with the hopes of generating revenue to put that school on par with other schools in this new world of college athletics. And it really follows a more business like model than ever before. And now we come to the college football playoff. Now, you don't need me to tell you that college bowl games, unfortunately, don't mean what they once did. It's all about the playoff now. So, quick history: college football adopted the 14 playoff during the 2014 season. That existed for 10 years. And then every year, if you remember, there was clamoring to expand the playoff, which they did last season, introduced the 12-team playoff. And invariably, whether it's 4 teams, 12 teams, 16 teams, 24 teams, somebody will be left on the cut line and somebody's going to have issues with being left out. For more on that, we welcome in one of our newest Sportscaster contributors, Emil Asaf.
I'm Emil Asaf. I am a TCU alum and I run a social media called Analytic Sports. And it's a huge time in the college football world right now. The college football playoff has been selected and there's a lot of controversy. Obviously, Notre Dame being left out. That is the big headline as they were a team that was in the top 10 almost throughout the entire season. But in the last moment, the committee decides to put in some different teams as a result of conference championship weekend. Now, I want to start with the inconsistency that we saw from the committee. I'm not necessarily mad at the committee for putting in Miami over Notre Dame, but rather for how they treated some other teams that had similar criteria. We'll start with Alabama. Alabama is a team that has 3 losses on the season. One of their biggest losses was this conference championship against Georgia, where they lost 28-7. And ultimately, the committee decided to not punish them at all for this conference championship appearance. They say that you earn the right to play in a game as big as the SEC title game, but this wasn't the case for BYU. BYU is a team that was also in their conference championship in the Big 12. They were 11-1 going into it, with their only loss being to Texas Tech, ranked top 3 in the country, which they happened to lose again. BYU moved down from being the number 11 team in the country, according to the CFP, down to number 12 as a result of their loss in the conference championship game. Alabama did not move at all, being the number 9 team and getting into the playoff despite more losses, despite their biggest win being Georgia, who just stomped them in the conference championship game. And BYU doesn't get a shot at the playoff as a result of them getting embarrassed in the national stage in the Big 12 championship game. And the reason why I'm talking about inconsistency is not necessarily because BYU deserved a spot. It's because there is a sense of bias in Alabama not being punished while BYU did get punished. I think the way for this to go should have been to either do this: not punish Alabama at all and leave them at that 9 spot, not punish BYU at all and put them into the college football playoff, or put Miami into the college football playoff. They have the head-to-head against Notre Dame, who was ranked number 10 in last week's college football playoff ranking, and also include Notre Dame, punishing both teams that ended up losing during conference championship weekend in very bad fashion. I think the answer, though, what the college football playoff committee is really looking at is the quality of wins that these teams had versus the losses necessarily that they had. Alabama, who did not move that much, had that win against Georgia, a top 5 team at the moment, had a win against Vanderbilt when they were undefeated and were off to their best start in the history of the program. They play in an SEC that is a gauntlet. They had a win against Missouri as well. That's why they're in. It's not necessarily championship weekend. It's not necessarily the 3 losses. That's why they're in. And that leaves us with the debate between Miami and Notre Dame, where, again, Notre Dame, despite not having the head-to-head, was above Miami every single week. until BYU moved down and they were right next to each other. So, with that said, here are the strength of record and the strength of schedule for Notre Dame and for Miami. Notre Dame had the 13th strength of record in the country, while Miami had the 14th strength of record. The strength of schedule for Notre Dame was 42nd, while Miami's was 44th. And once again, the marquee win that Miami had was beating a number 6 ranked Notre Dame at the time and having that head to head against them. The argument for Notre Dame right now is, well, they lost to Texas A&M by 1 point when they were ranked number 7 in the country. Right now, they only lost to Miami by 3 points. But ultimately, if you're a team that's not in a conference and has the opportunity to get a big time win against a powerhouse in college football like A&M or like Miami has been in the past, and you don't do it, it doesn't matter by how little or how much you lose by. It's about actually winning that game. Did Miami end up losing some pretty bad games? That being Louisville, that being SMU. Yes, they did, but they play in a Power Four conference, have the same record, have a very similar resume that Notre Dame has. So ultimately, they get it. That takes me to Texas, right? There's a big argument out there that Texas should have gotten a spot in the college football playoff, definitely from their fan base, and especially down here living in Texas, hearing these guys. The biggest argument with that is they played Ohio State week 1. If they would have played anybody else, they would have 2 losses. They would have an amazing win against Texas A&M. They would have had a great win against Vanderbilt, among other wins. But those same people will bash BYU for having an easy schedule and for defeating teams in the Big 12 like TCU, like Utah, a top 15 team being their best win, when those are supposed to be the games that you do win. Those games, Texas wasn't able to take care of. Not only did Texas lose to Ohio State and lose to Georgia in terrible fashion, they lost to 4-8 Florida, but they want to discredit BYU for going through a schedule and absolutely flying through it outside of Texas Tech. College football is a landscape where you cannot take any week for granted, right? So that brings me back to my argument about BYU. It doesn't matter who you play week to week. If you win 11 games in a Power Four conference, in a conference that you can't really assume every week is a free W, you should be in the playoff. And that same logic for Texas saying, hey, well, if we would have scheduled so and so, if we would have scheduled Rice instead of Ohio State, we would be 10-2. Well, no, you didn't go to 4-8 Florida and beat them. That's my big issue with the Texas argument. But like I said, ultimately, I do think the committee, despite a little bit of the inconsistencies, they put the best teams in. Miami and Notre Dame were the most comparable out of the teams that kind of got left out. Now, with Notre Dame, they did make the national championship last year. They have a great young quarterback in Carr. They have probably the best running back in the country in Jeremiah Love. But this is the start of a movement to push them to either continue to schedule hard games as the season goes along, because they played service academies. They did not play a lot of bowl eligible teams. Ultimately, they didn't have any top 10 ranked wins, and that's what it comes down to. With Notre Dame, they're either going to have to join a conference, and that's the message that the committee is sending, or they're going to have to stop scheduling Arkansas, who was at the bottom of the SEC. They're going to have a better win than USC, who was ranked number 20 at the time and ended up winning single digit games. I think Notre Dame was rightfully left out. That is the number one thing on the priority of the College Football Playoff Committee. That is the one thing that would have made a lot of fans upset, that would have made me upset, because going on a 10-game win streak does matter, like I just mentioned. So if you value that 10-game win streak whenever you're playing a bunch of schools that are not ranked in the top 15, then the committee should have valued BYU a lot higher, being in a Power Four conference, only losing to top 3 Texas Tech. Now, I want to talk about the format a little bit as well. It gets thrown out there that this team deserves it or this team deserves it. I believe there are only 6 deserving teams in the college football playoff right now. And moving from the 4-team format where you would have had to leave out most likely either Ohio State after just losing their single game against Indiana, now ranked number 1, or you would have had to leave out Texas A&M after a perfect season where they're 11-0 going to Austin. The Longhorns are on a hot streak and they end up losing that game. Or Ole Miss only lost to SEC champion Georgia, and that was an 8-point loss. But you probably leave them out because of their coach. So this format of 12 teams, it's not necessarily because teams 12-7 deserve a shot, right? It's more about sometimes there's more than 4 teams that deserve a shot at the national championship, and we're doing that for them. Everybody else can just be glad to be included. That includes Alabama, who we just talked about, with 3 losses, right? Miami with 2, Notre Dame with 2. In the former eras, if you lose one game, you are thankful for a magical season that you had as a team, as a program, and you go and play a different bowl game where you're not contending for the national championship. And that's the end of it. This is a new era that college football fans and college football programs have to appreciate, not just because of NIL, but because the expanded playoff gives a chance to multiple teams after one blunder. The problem is once you get past that one, if you're Texas with 3 losses, including 4-8 Florida, you're not deserving anymore. If you're Notre Dame with 2 losses to start out the season, especially Miami, who's one of the contending teams, and Texas A&M, you can't really blame anybody else but yourself. Now, I talk about those deserving teams because ultimately that to me is who is going to end up in the semifinals. It's not going to be any of the JMUs at 12s or Tulane at 11 or even Oklahoma being an 8 seed despite the incredible season that they had. I think Texas Tech has been so dominant and dominated BYU twice this season. Lost a game against Arizona State where they were playing against a backup quarterback with ASU's quarterback Sam Levitt not being in the lineup. A team like that, Texas Tech, is going to dominate so much. They'll be in the semifinal regardless of whether they play Oregon or JMU. Indiana, not too many people believed in Coach Signetti until these last 2 years with him coming over from JMU. But against all odds in the Big Ten championship, they defeat Ohio State, the defending champions, on a huge win streak. They're one of those teams that it doesn't matter who Alabama, who they play, whether that's Alabama or Oklahoma. They're going to be a team that's in the semifinal. And of course, we saw what Georgia just did to Alabama, avenging their only loss of the season, a close game in week 6 where they lose by a field goal at home. They come out and they absolutely stomp this Alabama team in the SEC championship. And now all they have to go through is either Ole Miss without Lane Kiffin or Tulane, who also lost 2 games playing in the regular season, playing in the American. That win against North Texas for Tulane was a great win. It gets them in the college football playoff. But this is not a team that's competing with those 6 deserving teams that we talked about. Same with Ohio State. They get the winner of A&M and Miami. That's the only one that could be complicated for this Ohio State team, with Indiana being really the only super tough game that they've played. They had a win in the game against Michigan, where Michigan had a little bit of a down year. They didn't get to double-digit wins. But other than that, they're not as tested this season by itself as these other teams. Regardless of that, it's going to be the top 4 that end up making it to the semifinals. And again, very few teams are deserving of competing for a national championship, while the other ones should just be happy to be included. Now, we'll make our final point just about these last 2 teams that enter the college football playoff, because there was an ACC team in Duke that snuck into the conference championship and ended up beating Virginia, and some people argued they had a case for the college football playoff despite being a 5-loss team. Of course, They were able to get in due to a 5-way tiebreaker against Miami, Georgia Tech, a bunch of these ACC teams that were 6-2 in the conference. Really weird tiebreaker rules. It ends up being Virginia at 7-1 in the conference that gets in, and Duke at 6-2. If you put a conference champion, which that would have been the case in the past, if you put a conference champion automatically in, and they automatically get a bye, we would have seen Tulane get a bye, and that just can't happen. And with Duke, if you can lose 5 games and still somehow make the final 12-team college football playoff bracket, then there's no point in playing the games. Those losses, those out of conference losses, those other losses have to have a downside. And that goes back to my point also about Texas, for example, scheduling Ohio State, Notre Dame scheduling A&M in Miami. If you wanted the benefit of the win, of having a marquee win early in the season, you have to be able to take the downside of not winning that game, and that is having an L on your record. I will give a shout out to Duke for being able to pull off that game against Virginia, ACC champions in overtime. Huge shout out to them. Not a college football playoff deserving team, and there's only very few teams that were truly deserving. We are stuck in an era where there should be an in-between. I think 12 teams is too much. I think 4 teams before was too little. But this thing keeps adapting year to year. So far, the inconsistencies from the committee have been pretty bad. We got to decide, we're going to punish teams for playing championship weekend, or we're not going to punish them at all. We got to decide, do we prioritize head-to-head, or do we prioritize whether a team was blowing out their opponents when they have similar resumes? In this case, only one team was punished, and that was BYU in comparison to Alabama. Miami ends up getting in because of the head-to-head against Notre Dame, and I'm glad it went that way. BYU kind of took for granted the fact that they were able to beat opponents week to week. But despite all that, I think this is going to be a great college football playoff. The top dogs are the ones that are deserving. Texas Tech, Indiana, Georgia, Ohio State. I'll even include Oregon in there, only having one loss against Indiana. A&M, only having one loss against the Longhorns on the road. And Ole Miss, one loss against Georgia. It's unfortunate that they lost their coach, but this is going to be an exciting playoff amongst the top dogs. Everyone else should just be happy to be included. Thank you guys once again. I'm Emil Asaf, aka Analytic Sports on social media. Thank you to Sportscaster for connecting me with this opportunity. And I hope you guys are happy with the college football playoff results, and we get to enjoy this exciting part of the season together. Thank you.
And thank you, Emil. That was Sportscaster.com's Emil Asaf. Brings up a lot of good points here. Is a 12-team playoff too much? Should it expand? Maybe contract to 8 teams? And does it bother you that bowls don't seem to matter anymore, at least in terms of what they used to mean? Opting not to participate in bowl games this season, Notre Dame, Iowa State, Kansas State, Kansas, Florida State, Auburn, UCF, Baylor, Rutgers, Temple. It's really the haves and have-nots. For some schools and their athletes, the opportunity to play in a showcase for these seniors, the last time they'll put on a college football jersey, it should matter. But for some of the schools listed above, if they're not in the running for a national championship, they say, why bother? Now, some schools are going through coaching changes, and obviously every situation is different, but, I don't like it, to be frank. There's now a shortage of bowl-eligible teams. For example, 5-7 Appalachian State will play Georgia Southern in the Birmingham Bowl after a number of other 5-7 teams turned down that opportunity. Now, I love bowl season, but there's a decreased importance, and now some view the bowls as simply glorified exhibitions. In the past, when high-profile players opted out of bowl games to focus on draft preparation, potentially avoid injury, you could make sense of that. But now schools are entirely opting out of the participation of being in bowls, and that, for me, is hard to come to terms with. Unless there's a path to a national championship, some schools figure, what's the point? One thing we've learned obviously over the course of time is that things do change, things constantly evolving. I mentioned they had the 14 playoff for a decade. Now we're in this current 12-team format. Again, with NIL, the transfer portal, college coaching changes across the landscape, like everything is changing. Obviously, colleges are now operating more in a business-like fashion. So I don't know where it's going to go. All we can deal with is the way it currently looks today. I don't necessarily love it. I love college bowl season. I know a lot of our listeners do as well. But, even the names of bowls, I mean, you can kind of scoff at some of that stuff, like, the importance of playing in a Pop-Tarts bowl as opposed to playing in a Rose Bowl, does it carry the same weight? Some of these schools are willing to take on the fines that are being levied by their own conferences by refusing to participate in a bowl. And then you see other schools like Vandy. They say, we love to play football. We're going to play. So, if you love the sport, more games, the better, in my opinion. You'd like college football to last all season long, for 12 calendar months. Obviously, that's impossible. But, you want to see more teams, more bowls, more games. But the way it currently is, like I said, unless there's a path to a national championship, some of these schools say, you know what, we're going to pack it in, and our season is completed. So hopefully your team will be participating in this second season coming up here through December and January. But again, if we know anything about college football and the landscape, it is ever changing, and who knows what is to come in the years ahead. I do want to thank all our guests this week. Emil Asaf, the TCU graduate, for his commentary on the current 12-team playoff and how it affects the bowl picture. J.C. Fox from Mississippi College on the coaching carousel in college football. And Noah Shamami from Full Sail University about the inner workings of the new nonprofit arm called Spartan Ventures in East Lansing. That's going to do it for our show this week. I'm Johnny Kane. We'll be back with you again next Wednesday night right here on Open Mic. And until then, Godspeed.